On this episode of the Penultimate podcast, we dive into a conversation with UK's Ben Simons, a two-time Olympic bobsled athlete, high-level former decathlete, and stud strength coach. We learn about Ben's story and how he ended up where he's at today. We also get to have a discussion on the concepts and aspects behind general physical preparation and more sport-specific elements, and where athletes really need to be investing the mass majority of their time to get the most bang for their buck. Some of these things may surprise you. Don't go anywhere. This was an amazing podcast, and you have so much to learn from this exceptionally talented individual.
The Penultimate podcast is powered by Project Pure Athlete. Visit projectpureathlete.com and check out the complete line of PPA training and technique products. All products are created by the Jump Guy and have been used and endorsed by coaches and athletes worldwide. Jump higher, train smarter.
You are now listening to the Penultimate podcast with the Jump Guy, Tyler Ray, powered by Project Pure Athlete. Jump higher, train smarter.
All right, so we are here with Ben Simons, not Simmons like the basketball player. We got that taken care of. This has been a long time coming, man. I'm super excited to be able to have you on this podcast. You've been an advocate for PPA for a long time, but more importantly, I've been keeping my eye on you and what you're doing on your end overseas. And I just want to say thank you for taking your time to be here with me today, man.
It's an absolute pleasure. I've been following you for a while, and there's been a lot of back and forth over social media, so it's nice to finally do this kind of e-meeting through a screen and get to chat a bit.
Absolutely. So for those that are listening right now, or if you're watching our beautiful faces over YouTube and you don't know who Ben is, I'm going to give you the spotlight, Ben. I'm going to give you some time here to kind of walk us through like a Cole's Nose version of how you came up, some of the sports you were involved in, and what you're doing now.
Yeah. Okay. So pretty hyperactive kids. Easiest way for my parents to wear me out was to throw me into whatever sport was available at the time. I think that's the case for a lot of people that end up being sports people. It's a way to burn off energy, right? So I was just doing every sport that I could do. And in growing up in England, it's always football first and foremost. So it was football first. I played a lot of rugby. I did track and field quite early, actually, which I was lucky with, because there was a local, we call it athletics over here. There's a local athletics club, which they start kids at about 7, 8 years old, and they do what we call sports hall athletics. So it's indoors. You know, we haven't got great winters just like you're used to over there. So I went through that kind of background with infant sports, I would say. And then it became quite apparent that I was much better at speed and power. So sprints and long jump were the main things I was good at as I would say, teenager. But at that point, I was playing a lot of rugby as well. And I kind of had to make a decision, I think, before I went to university. So I was off to university to study sports science. I kind of had to make the decision there which sport I wanted to pursue, because at that point I was doing decathlon, which, as you know, is incredibly demanding training wise.
It's not the
and
easiest.
That, along with rugby, those two sports, they're just not going to work together training wise. So at that point, I chose to pursue athletics and specifically decathlon at that point. But I was very lucky in that, quite randomly, I found out that a track and field coach lived within the same area as me growing up. And I'm in quite a small rural area. And it turns out he'd, I think, coached athletes at 5 different Olympics. He was predominantly high jump and basically had a facility in his back garden. So there had been, on a local Air Force base, an indoor arena where they would do most of the championships in the kind of early 90s. And they ripped all of the Mondo track surface out of that indoor arena, and he got it and laid it in his back garden.
Oh, wow.
So it was a back garden training venue, garage gym. And then obviously this wizened coach who had been coaching for decades and decades and decades. So he was my coach then and kind of has acted as a mentor ever since that point. Obviously with him being high jump, it was very jump centric, all of the training that we were doing. And at that point it was still decathlon that I was pursuing. Then a lot of injuries came, which I think is the case for a lot of athletes and especially decathletes. A lot of them were just me being a young man and doing silly things, playing five-a-side football, jumping off cliffs on my bike. A lot of them were not sports-related injuries, which is unfortunate. People are like, oh, well, were you doing too much? Was it overuse injuries? But a lot of it was just doing silly things outside of the sporting environment. So that made jumping actually horizontal jumping, because at that point I thought, well, decathlon might be out the window here. So you've got all of those events to do on ankles at this point, which I'd had to have a couple of operations on. So horizontal jumps were what I tried to pursue. Ankles again, wouldn't take that. So then it whittled down to sprint. So I was kind of at the point where I was left with the most simple thing that I could do without getting hurt. I wasn't the most talented guy at top end, and I'm sure you see this a lot now with people who are very gifted in kind of speed, strength, or power, may not have the top end gas or velocity that you would see in elite level track guys, but could blast a lot of people over 40 yards.
Right.
It seems to be a trend that I see, and I was lucky that I found a niche in bobsleigh. And it was a pretty random journey. I was at my university at this point training, studying at master's level. I was still training sprints, more recreationally at this point. But there was a poster on the notice board in the training center. It said, could you push your country at the next Olympics? 4 guys jumping into a sled.
Yeah.
And it said like open testing, 30-meter sprint, standing long jump, squat, bench press. I thought they're my favorite exercises. I'm going to go for that. And at that point I thought, do you know what? I knew a little bit about the sport. I was smaller than the athletes that were involved in it, but I thought that looks like a fun testing session. Lay down some numbers. Anyway, I laid down some pretty good numbers and went from there. And at that point it was a process. It was like a knockout process. So you had to make it past the physical standards. Then we have a dry land push track. So it's a facility where we push a sled on wheels. You might have seen it on my social media. It's almost like a glorified version of the sled they use in Cool Runnings when they're off down a hill in Jamaica. And you had to push a certain time on there. And from that point, yeah, it was like a process where you get knocked out at every stage. And before I knew it, I was being pushed off the side of a mountain, feeling like I was going off Niagara Falls in a trash can. And yeah, I think it was probably 18 months later, I was at the Winter Olympics in Sochi. And at that point was the only athlete from that talent ID process, which the poster was part of, that had actually made it through to the games. So it was quite an achievement, but it was just such over a 2-year, 18-month period. It was just a complete whirlwind, but it just clicked. I just found this niche that I was really good at. I was always a great accelerator and good at static jumps, counter movement jumps, anything that's a pure kind of power movement, and pushing a sled just came to me very naturally. It did mean I had to put a lot of weight on, but I didn't mind that process. You know, it's a lot of fun pumping iron, eating calories, but and I mean, it's another discussion in itself. That's actually helped me in the last 8 years since I started, as far as my raw power measures go. So yeah, that was quite long-winded, but it's quite an up and down and all over the place journey in my sporting career.
Absolutely. I mean, you've had a very like diverse story of sport and athletic. I mean, I think I think bonded initially over the track and field background. Myself also being someone that participated in multi events, decathlon, and jumps and sprints. And I think this whole community is really just bonded by their love for power sports in general. So really neat to be able to see someone that's made a transition into something like bobsleigh. I know in Canada, they used to source a lot of the Canadian athletics for bobsled athletes because of the fact that we had that raw capacity for power. That's such a great story. And at the highest level too, I think a lot of people don't realize is like, to make it to the Olympic Games in any event or any sport is an absolute struggle and such a huge accomplishment. It must have made you feel so complete and whole on so many levels.
Yeah, that experience and what it's done for me is really it's hard to describe. I dreamt of the Olympics from a young age, but I never ever believed that it was possible. And in fact, the school that I went to and the tiny village that we was in had a distant connection to the Olympic Games, because when the movement was being brought around in just over 100 years ago, they actually visited that small village because there was a kind of remake of the ancient Greek Olympics there by a local doctor. And so it's a bit of a long story, but Pierre de Coubertin, who started the new Olympic movement, modern Olympic movement, he came to the village to watch it. So this small little village was really proud of its Olympic roots. So for me growing up, I started at that athletics club, and my first memories of sport were Linford Christie winning the Barcelona Olympics in 100 meters.
He's he's one of my favorite all-time sprinters. I love watching Linford Christie run, and I still go back and watch old tape of him.
Yeah, I think sprinting now misses that. I don't know I think some sprinting purists miss the aggression of the old sprinters.
Yes,
and I think that's what I loved about Linford. You wouldn't step in front of Linford on the line when he was running, not a chance. And since then I've met a lot of people and a lot of people in my sport that have been coached by Linford over the years. And he was actually randomly at one of our races in Austria one year filming a TV program. So that was a really surreal experience for me. So yeah, the dream was there from a young age, but I never really believed. I had no right to believe I could make it because I wasn't good enough. I wasn't a bad long jumper and sprinter, as kind of national, and I had a couple of international competitions, but never to, as you say, to make it to the Olympics is just the next level again. And even in bobsleigh, where participation numbers are smaller, still the amount of slots to qualify for an Olympic Games and the criteria set by your nation is always going to be based at your medal potential, your potential to do well at the Games. It's another step to make it to the Olympics. And our qualification experience going to Sochi, which was my first Games, was literally like it was a roller coaster ride. No pun intended there, but it was such a lengthy and stressful experience.
Right.
So yeah, it's all been pretty crazy. And that, like I said, with that happening in 18 months, that's pretty crazy. I've been training at that point, I've been training seriously for 10 years, but for something else. What it actually did was improve my chances of going in this sport that I hadn't imagined before.
Yes.
And because of where my talents lay, it just improved my propensity to push things. And I've hit the ground running. But you can imagine yourself, it's being a former decathlete, if you had the chance to push a sled, and this is often why decathletes make such good bobsledders, because they're definitely at the strength end of the track and field spectrum.
Right.
but they're quicker than a thrower, right? And they've got to obviously jump 7 to 8 meters, running, low 11s to low 10s even for some great decathletes. And you can imagine if you'd have got behind a sled in your prime, that probably could have been something that you could really have anchored down with and been talented at. And I think there's a lot of people, what we find in bobsled is there's some freak athletes that find a niche within our sport. And I just happened to find that. So
yeah, I think about it. I actually think about it still. I had an opportunity at one point to go and undertake some bobsled, and I there was other life stuff that had come up at that time. But yeah, that'd be I think an experience, if anything else, just to find out what it would be like to get behind a sled and just put some energy behind it. Because yeah, you're absolutely right, and I love how you equated that to like the strength end of the track spectrum, because that's what it was. It was like I had this ability to learn skill, which was, I think, as a decathlete, you have to have that motor control, like at a very high level, to be able to acquire new skills quickly and then be very proficient at them as well. But it was like I was never fast enough to be a sprinter. I was never jumping far enough to be a long jumper or high enough to be a high jumper. But you do everything kind of within that like moderate to high end window that really makes you ideal for that sport. So we appreciate you sharing that with our community here. Now, where's your training at right now? What keeps you motivated moving forward? If you haven't seen Ben's Instagram and social media, this guy is constantly putting in work and still an absolute physical specimen. Moving into your 30s, and you're training at an incredibly high level still. What keeps that motivation going? What are you working at currently?
So I can't imagine. I can't imagine a life without training, because I've trained for so long. So it's just literally become part and parcel of my day-to-day life. And I think it's an interesting route for a track and field or bobsleigh athlete. For the most part, those sports are amateur until you are at the very top. It's very different in other sports. So if we think about soccer over here, or football over here as we call it, basketball over with you guys, even down to Canadian football, those are very professional from even from the lower end. So right. Money is always a factor. My drive to train is not money orientated. So I can't imagine not training. So basically, I train because I love it, actually, first and foremost. So when people talk about sacrifice with training, it takes so much sacrifice. Well, I actually love training, and if it wasn't going to get me to the Olympics, or it wasn't going to get me paid, I'd still train. So a lot of it is it's just an innate desire to train hard and push myself. People push themselves in other areas, and I love pushing myself in training. For me also, there's always a chance to compete. I've become very proficient and good at the job that I do pushing a bobsleigh over the last 8 years. And I'm now, after some reflection, going to push for my third Olympics, which will be 2022 in Beijing.
Amazing.
And it's been an interesting decision, because I didn't see myself carrying on after Pyeongchang, which was in 2018. And also our sport in the UK, we lost our funding at the time. So much like, I don't know the ins and outs of the Canadian Sport Fund for Olympic sports, but I think in the UK it's similar, in that there's a centralized pot of money. In the UK, it comes from our national lottery that funds Olympic sports. But there's a lot of strict criteria you've got to hit. We hit that over a few years, maintain our funding. Our results at the Olympics weren't very good, and that all went. So I had to think about, obviously, feeding myself at that point.
Yeah.
And that's where I started, really. And it's been a blessing, really, because that's where I started coaching. That's where I started getting my sports therapy qualifications, looking beyond what just myself as an athlete. And I've really enjoyed it. I enjoy coaching as much as I enjoy competing, and I'm sure you found the same passion very early since you were dunking and competing in decathlon. And I think there are certain athletes that love coaching or would be good coaches, but there are a lot of others that can't fill that role.
Yeah,
and
right.
I can imagine that's been your experience as well.
Yeah, largely. I mean, I say still that I actually find more satisfaction, I think, overall as a coach than I did as an athlete. And I thought as an athlete that I would never find that intrinsic satisfaction at that level anywhere else, because it was like yourself, you're kind of, there's this umbrella of passion that I think really, surrounds everything that we do. And as athletes, that passion is so individualized. It's me. It's like, I want to be better. I want to improve. I want to be taking those next steps and pushing myself. But as a coach, there's still that individual element of like, I want to grow. I want to improve. I want to continue mastering my craft. But the residual of it is I'm helping athlete A, B, C, D, and E also feel the same thing. So it's like it amplifies the amount of reward in a lot of ways for me to work in this field. So that it's actually a great segue. So you had mentioned that you kind of worked through, you have your master's, you worked through a sports therapy degree. You're an exercise science major in general. What are you doing right now on the coaching scene where you're at to give back? Like who are you working with currently, or where do you find yourself spending the majority of your coaching energy?
So obviously the online platform has blown up over the last few years, and I started off there. So I'd always given a lot of advice to athletes around me in whatever training center I was at, and that was just open discussion between everybody. And it's probably where a lot of us learn most of our information, actually, in the trenches, so to speak. But then it came from requests over Instagram. So I was posting videos of me doing box jumps and static jumps, anything powerful really. And I just started getting requests for programs, or what you're doing. And I'd never allowed one coach to program me over the years. I was always very involved in my programming, which is something that a lot of athletes don't really do. They like to keep that responsibility somewhere else. But I didn't feel like I was being accountable enough with my knowledge if I didn't at least question some parts of my programming and drew influence from elsewhere. Because I was very lucky to have a number of good coaches and influences around me in the setup that we had at the time.
Right.
So I took influence from elsewhere. So I'd drawn up a very clear view of what I thought worked programming wise and what I saw work for the different individuals within the squads I worked in. So at that point, I started actually writing the odd program for people just because they'd requested it. Then the request became too much, essentially. I'm not going to be spending hours. At that point, I was a funded athlete. I could have some spare time to consolidate my thoughts with some athletes who wanted a program that worked for both of us. It got to the point where I just didn't have the time and to honor all of these requests that were coming in. So at that point, it looked like a viable business, and that literally fell in line with when I started losing my full-time athlete status, so my wage, so to speak,
right,
from competing. So it started online, and then at that point, I always knew that I wanted to take sports massage qualifications and get into sports therapy. So I was very lucky in that we can get the odd grant as well. When we come, there's a transition off the funding ladder in the UK where you can get some grants to further yourself and get some qualifications. So
that's smart.
It really is, and that helped me lots because they're not cheap. So I did personal training, I did sports massage, and my most recent one was sports acupuncture as well. So, at that point, I was just setting myself up to ultimately be the best coach that I could be. But at the same time, it was a necessity because I needed to earn money. So I could coach, I could do my sports massage, and that was enough to, to keep me going while still keeping my foot in the door and training. Because I had a real dilemma, because I applied for a job in recruitment as well, and I would have had to move down to London and really just step into that 9-to-5 life.
Right.
And that represents stability, but it didn't sit well with me, my passion. I'd put my heart and soul into physical preparation from probably 16 years old. And yeah, money wasn't enough to drag me away from that. So
Absolutely.
I thought, right, I need to really get as much knowledge as I can and enough qualifications to be able to go out and work with people. And the process has just been, it doesn't feel like work, especially one-to-one training. When you get a group of guys in a facility and you might have the vertec out and it's a max out vertical jump day and the energy's going on in there, it's very similar to the process that I think you've been through, in that I always doubted whether I could get the same rewards from seeing other people do well physically, and it wasn't just myself. Because sport is, a lot of people don't like to admit it, but it's incredibly selfish. Sport's an incredibly selfish area.
It has to be in a lot of ways. Yeah,
it does, and because it's very hard to be successful if you don't think that way. But so that I was worried that I wouldn't get the same reward from coaching other people, but I've had a very similar kind of epiphany in that it's almost, I could say it's more satisfying seeing other people do well. And it's come full circle because I'm now programming for some of the guys that are in my squad.
that's
so
awesome.
We will eventually, because I'm going for the next Olympics, we will compete against each other. But me seeing them do well now, because they're young bucks coming through, with far more potential than I ever had. And, I feel that responsibility is that they can get the most out of themselves. And a big thing is not make the mistakes that I make. I think everybody who has competed at a high level gets to the end of their career and there's a few things that they wish they would have known when they were younger.
Yes.
And I think as a coach, it's your responsibility to not let those athletes fall into those traps, because I would say for the most part, most sportsmen and athletes I don't think they reach their genetic potential.
I completely agree. And you actually made a great segue within what you were saying into the concept of, you've been physically preparing, or this physical preparation, for such a long time. I want to dive into that a little bit with you, because we have, with you on here, we have a very unique perspective of someone that competed at an exceptionally high level individually, but then also is now coaching in that same respect. So on the topic of physical preparation, we talked a little bit before the podcast started about how I think social media is great in so many ways, that it connects a lot of minds, it connects a lot of athletes to those minds and athletes to other athletes. But I think what happens is there's still this kind of, clickbaity, sensationalized aspect to social media that can really skew the perception of what it really takes to be an athlete that competes at a high level and make that progress over the appropriate amount of time. We're inundated with 8 weeks to this, 3 months to this, and really the journey of an athlete is not measured in weeks, months. It's measured in years, and really a commitment to that process. So as you program now for, and as you are coaching these guys that are on the up and up, what are some of the key components of the training that you're providing to them that some of our younger athletes that are making these progressions can really learn from? Like, what are the general population missing? Like, what's not being said enough?
From my perspective, most of the guys that I program for are simply not fit enough. And that's something that is missed out almost entirely from the flashy posts that you see on Instagram. So we talked about general preparation period. Obviously, that is in track and field, that always happens. And in field sports, you might call it off season. And I think especially for people just perhaps wanting to dunk or jump high, they don't see the more holistic side of the program, that you need to be a better athlete and a more powerful organism as a whole to really excel in the really high velocity movements. And so what I find is I get a lot of athletes coming to me who have been cherry picking exercises, very high intensity exercises from social media for a long time. They're not high level athletes already, so they have no right to be exploring those exercises because they haven't got the fundamentals down. They're banged up because they've been hitting too much high intensity without building volume up to that point, and they're simply not fit enough. So I've had a few guys recently that jump on my if someone comes to me wanting to jump high, I always start them on general prep, pretty much, unless their training history, they've literally just done a block of general prep style work. I'll start them on general prep and I'll hit them hard with, they'll be surprised at the aerobic component. And obviously you coming from Canada, I get a lot of my stuff from Charlie Francis as well. You know, I always looked into his teachings back in the day, and I include tempo, and I include one of the S&C sessions is what I call S&C conditioning, and that's hard work. That's hard work. It's there's a large aerobic component, and there's a a glycolytic component as well. You're going to be burning, you're going to be working hard, and I get a lot of people going, that session was solid. That put me through the mill, like 15 reps here and there, 12 reps here and there, short recoveries, and that's only in there once a week. Like, obviously we've still got the bread and butter strength and power movements, but that seems to be what really is a plateau bust. Some of these guys that have been just hitting high intensity movements for years, they work through range and they work through fatigue, and they get fitter as an individual. So their baseline aerobic fitness goes up there without getting too jargony here. Their substrate stores go up and their capacity goes up, their work capacity goes up. It's also an investment. So what I find is people tend to there's a ton of easily accessible improvements to be made through general means before you graduate to doing something more specific and flashy.
Right.
You have no right to be hitting those really flashy specific exercises unless you've really got everything you can get out of general means. And if you're anything sub-elite really in whatever you're doing, general means tend to give you the best bang for your buck. So most of the guys that come to me, I'll start them off general preparation, I'll get them fit. They tend to get a ton of improvement in that general preparation period. Then what happens is I find less plateaus going through what I call the specific preparatory periods after that. You get less plateaus and then again less injuries. Then the real challenge comes if I'm working long term is when to throw another general prep back in, because I don't want to take them too far away from what I've done there.
Right.
And, coming from track and field, that's going to be very familiar to you. That was that's often the setup that people use. With field sport guys, it's a little bit, or court guys, games guys, as I would call basketball, American football, soccer. It's a little bit different. You've probably got a shorter period to work with them in the off season. But for me, it's even more important to get good volume and general load in at that point, so that carries them through the season on the pitch. Then at that point, I get a lot of people that want a supplementary program, so something that works around what they're doing on the pitch. Again, that's a time that's even just as important to make sure you nail your general exercises, because I think the temptation is to try and mimic things that they're doing on the pitch. But really, the demands of what they're doing on the pitch keep those tools sharp. You got to make sure they can turn up and keep competing at that level. So when I'm setting the programs for the court or games-based guys, yeah, I make sure that it's how it's integrated into their working week or their training week, as you call it.
Right.
So it definitely differs between, obviously, for what the goal is. But for me, time and time again, it's about people missing the basics, the bread and butter, and, you know, just getting some work done and getting fit.
Yeah, we completely agree.
It doesn't look cool and, you know, they probably want to post it on Instagram, and it doesn't look too cool when you're sweating away trying to push out your last press up. But when they then post that video of them jumping 6 inches higher, it all comes together.
It all comes full circle. And we say that all the time. You know, our channel is one that, you know, every other comment or DM we get is really, you know, what's the best. It's always what's the best, or what's the key, or what's one thing I can do. And the unpopular answer, as you've mentioned, is really that this is such a process of putting in that general work over time, with sprinkling in the sport specific elements, when you've, like you said, you've earned the right to be able to dive into that type of stimulus, because there's really better athletes make better jumpers. And that's what we do with our training is, and again, it might not be the flashiest, but we're really training the whole athlete to be a better athlete with a bias toward vertical jump training or jumping in general. And I think the term jump training is being tossed around a little bit too much, in my opinion, because jump training really should be just training. It's progressive, good rooted training with emphasis on general physical preparation and sprinkling in those sport specific elements when you've gotten to a point where you can sustain that on a physiological level. So it's really nice to hear and see. And I think for athletes that are listening or watching, to really understand that this is how training is done at the highest levels, that the, you know, super cool exercise that you see on one person's channel and the super cool exercise you see on another person's channel, just by combining them together doesn't give you a training program. It just gives you two very different, varying degrees of stimulus that may or may not cause you to be injured or may not cause you to make progress. So we are big on maintaining the basics, and we do work with a lot of, like you're saying, court athletes. We call them team sport athletes in general, because I think the demands of team sport are different in the sense that people are trying to make these vertical jump gains within the confines of their competitive season, and the games you play largely as a power sport or power speed athlete are in themselves an incredible exposure to power and speed stimulus. So just by dumping more of that on them doesn't, if anything else, it just bottoms them out in a lot of ways. So we're really spending the mass majority of our time. We're really, you know, the biggest bang for our buck is making sure that GPP follows them all the way through their competitive season to support their body as they really get that sport specific or specialized physical elements from their team sport itself. So, so developing athlete. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you ever find you have a problem with buy-in with, for example, basketball or volleyball athletes? When you tell them that they don't need to jump more to jump higher, in fact, it could cause you to get injured. How do you find buy-in there? Because I have to convince a lot of athletes that are coming over from specifically volleyball and basketball, who are jumping hundreds of times a week, that they don't need to jump more. They need to create a stronger and more stable base for them to jump from. So their structure, soft tissue, their neural drive all needs to be developed, but it needs to be developed elsewhere, because they're already getting a massive exposure to that high velocity movement. Like you've just said, that you can't just dump more plyometrics and jumping on them. It doesn't make any sense. So I was just wondering, from your perspective, how you get buy-in from those athletes.
Yeah, you know, that's a constant struggle, and I think if you are not necessarily a business or a program or a coach that wears that sensationalized element on the surface, then you're going to have a difficult time with onboarding athletes in the sea of what's available through social media. That being said, we've kind of taken an approach of almost like daring people to train the right way. So it's more along the lines of like, yeah, go ahead and you can cherry pick and find exercises that you'd like, or you can come and work with people that have done this themselves to a very high level and run multiple athletes to the highest level through this course over and over and over again. And it becomes almost like I dare you probably won't be able to make it, or you probably, and it gets a little bit of that competitive fire going. But from the perspective of buy-in, I think it's always going to be an uphill battle. Basketball is, in my opinion, probably the most challenging athlete to work with overall, largely because the mass majority of basketball players ascend to the level they are with almost no exposure to the weight room, because it's really just you're getting better at the skill of playing basketball, right? And there's a lot that can be done without necessarily having a big front squat or being able to pull weight off the floor, or be more stable, because you've developed that specificity of stability within the confines of your sport, but not realizing that there's more. And I think that's really at the end of the day, what it comes down to for me is the quote unquote natural athlete understanding that they don't just have to be a natural athlete. There are aspects of kind of layering more resiliency onto you that can be really beneficial. Like that's my story largely, is that I really didn't start training per se until almost university. Like when my first year, 19, 20 years old, I was a pretty gifted quote unquote natural athlete. I could jump pretty high, I could dunk a basketball in high school. I was a almost 7-meter long jumper in high school, and almost a 2-meter high jumper with only just being naturally good at jumping. When I hit that university level and I started putting that work in and understanding that, if you're willing to push yourself that little bit extra, that's really what separates the good athlete from the great athlete at the end of the day. But it doesn't always look pretty, and this was pre-Instagram and pre-YouTube, as I'm sure some of your career was as well.
Definitely.
And you're working out for yourself. And I think if people are coming in with the mentality of I want to jump higher and I want to do it in 6 weeks, that's really the poorest mentality to approach anything with. Is I have a timeline for my success, because that's just not the case, right? We understand that it's a commitment to a lifestyle and a commitment to a journey that reveals its benefit progressively and over time.
Definitely. And I see that time and time again in my sport, because for a lot of the guys that find themselves in my sport, they haven't reached the upper echelons in whatever sport they've come from before. So quite often that's track and field. They find themselves proficient at another sport, which allows them X amount of years of more training. Whereas in the other sport, they would have probably stopped at that point and thought, right, it's time to move on. A very good example is one of my teammates he's from the same area as me. So we used to sprint against each other. And he was we were good sprinters. He was better than me. He ran, I think, 10.5 at probably 21 years old.
Fast,
so it's pretty good, but you wouldn't expect that guy to go to an Olympics, for example. I know what the talent pool is like in Canada as well as Great Britain. There's some quick guys out there, and running that pace at that age, you're probably not going to have your sights set on the Olympic Games. He was an awesome accelerator as well, and found his way into bobsleigh at a similar time to me. And probably 4 or 5 years later, he ran 9.96 for the 100 meters. Yeah.
Wow.
And he would have never been given a chance in track and field, because he didn't reach the required time over 100 meters at a young enough age. But then come 27 years old, he was actually the third quickest Briton ever and the quickest that year running sub 10. So yeah, it's a process. You never know where the genetic ceiling is for you. Some people's genetic floor is like, I like to see it like a floor and a ceiling. Your ceiling might be here, but your floor might be here. Somebody else's floor might be right up here, but their ceiling's here. So they're going to show talent straight away at a younger age. And they get investment as well. And they're more likely to go to a high level within the sport. But you never know where your ceiling is. And it's been the same for me. I've reached physical standards that I never thought were possible for me. But I've lived the incredible life of being able to be a full-time athlete and compete at the peak of my life and my physicality, which is something that a lot of people don't get the privilege to hit, because life comes to you fast, right? And you've got to concentrate on other things. But if there's consistency throughout, there's no saying that you can't hit those limits that you thought were beyond you.
Yeah.
And I think it is about consistency. It's 100% about consistency.
Yeah, that's always going to be the battle. Out. Yeah, that's always going to be the battle, I think, is at the end of the day, if you're dipping your toe in, if you're just kind of interested in doing something like jumping higher, running faster, being stronger, there's no dipping your toe in and sampling the water and expecting a result. Like, you have to get in, you have to submerge yourself. And if there's not that underlying passion that I think that really holds people accountable over time, then to me, it's like you're more just a fan of sports. You're more just a fan of training, or you're a fan of the concept behind what it could be. So yeah, it really, really does come down to that consistency element. Now, Ben, for these young athletes that are listening, and even the more mature athletes that have been in this game a long time, that maybe are starting to give advice to younger athletes, let's talk about some like bang for your buck movements, or where time should be spent when it comes down to, like, we already touched on, obviously, like GPP is incredibly important, but like what specifically, aside from like our, the aerobic, like put them in the weeds workout that you mentioned, are you having these athletes spend time on? And then I'll kind of, bridge that with if we're doing similar things or anything different as well.
Okay, so I think as far as strength development goes, I'm a big fan of the trap bar deadlift, and I think it's probably the best bang for your buck exercise that you can do in the gym, and that's because of the variability of it as well. Because you can get an athlete who has never lifted any weight before that can probably pull a unladen trap bar off the ground. You can also put that trap bar on blocks if their mobility isn't good enough to pull it with a straight back, for example. And then at the same time, you can identify those range of movement issues that they may have. So it's a good diagnosis tool for coaches as well. And that works, I think, literally from young athletes starting to strength train all the way to an athlete like me in their 30s, pulling a trap bar deadlift for a high intensity, or a trap bar jump for me at this point. It's as good a stimulus as you can get in the gym. And it's pretty simple. You're going to get the most bang for your buck there. I'm not saying it's the only thing you should do, but I think it represents a easier and safer movement for most athletes to do. And I see time and time again more issues coming from other commonly used movements in the gym. And I've had more issues myself with, I still squat, I still deadlift, I still power clean, but I'm 33 years old and I've been learning those over more than 10 years now. And if I could go back, I would use the trap bar deadlift and variants of it a lot more. Because even when you get to eccentric loading, you can put in a tempo lower, you can put in a high velocity drop, you can do a Romanian deadlift lower with a trap bar lift up, so you're overloading the hamstrings. You can do trap bar jumps, you can dump the bar so you're not overloading, like we spoke about before,
right,
and overloading an axial load on the spine. So it's a safer movement. Obviously, you can always let go. So I think strength-wise, bang for your buck, trap bar deadlift. I think people that are training for vertical jump and maybe aren't necessarily team sport athletes, so just dunkers, for example,
sure,
I don't think they spend enough time running. So obviously you're looking for your high-end anaerobic work, your hill sprints and sprints in general, but then I'm also a huge fan of tempo runs, so lower intensity running. And there is the aerobic component there that people may think is counterintuitive and probably won't make you jump high. And there are some arguments to why that can help you. It's probably beyond the realm of this podcast today. But there are stiffness qualities that you can develop with lots of contacts, especially on a soft surface like grass. And for most of my guys that I'm coaching just to jump higher, it's probably only one session a week, but that covers a lot of bases. And I think it covers some of the abilities that you'll develop through more intensive plyometrics. So I think people go too intense with their plyos. My knees today in the morning are a testament to the fact that I went too intense on my plyos too young. I was too knee dominant in my plyos too young. If I'd have done more in extensive plyometrics and tempo running with taller hips, more focus at the hip joint rather than the knee, I believe I wouldn't be in with the pain that I'm in nowadays. So I think, especially for the young guys, those would be my three go-to bang for your buck. Away from, I think number one is jump technique, away from jump technique. And I know that obviously you've been at the forefront of that, and especially with popularizing a terminology that everybody understands, which I think is perfect. Because especially 2-foot jump technique is very misunderstood because it hasn't been looked at in as much detail as track and field jumping, which is always off 1 foot.
correct.
So number one is technique, but you need a good coach for that.
Absolutely.
So from your own perspective, if anybody that's listening, strength-wise, trap bar deadlift, make sure you're running and make sure you're getting extensive plyos in.
I love that. I love the fact that you brought up running. That's a question we get all the time. You know, someone will say in every live, you know, I run a couple times a week. Should I stop this to be able to maximize my vertical? And for me, there's kind of there's a couple ways I approach this. Number one is, if you do something that makes you happy, if you like to do something, do it. Unless you are in that kind of top 0.5% of individual that's competing at the very top of their sport. Let's say you are a dunker that has already a really good basis of stiffness and all these things that have been accumulated over time, then throwing in a couple like long distance runs a week might not be ideal for your situation. However, when you're a developing athlete, like you're saying, that's what people I think don't realize is the stiffness and a lot of that elasticity is built up over a extensive duration of time with a multitude of lower intensity contacts. That extensive plyometric, concept really is just accumulating those small contacts build the progressive stiffness in a lot of those tendon structures that people are like, well, how do I improve my stiffness and do it in like 6 weeks? It's not going to be sitting there trying to do these loaded. Exactly. It doesn't work that way. The amount of adaptation that's required for the body to be able to build the tissue appropriately takes a long period of time. So I love that. The trap bar deadlift, I can completely agree with. I love the accessibility of a trap bar deadlift, the barrier to entry trajectory is very low, and the amount of success an athlete can experience on that at a very quick or young age is high. And I think that's big for a coach, is to be able to give an athlete that feeling of empowerment and success very quickly in the process, right? Nothing worse than bringing a new athlete on and being like, okay, we're going to learn a front squat. You don't have requisite stability or mobility to do it. We're going to jam you through that because we know got to do front squats, but it takes too long to be able to get that success moment. I also like how safe it is on the shoulder girdle, the upper back. It helps athletes find and source that external torque through their shoulders, whereas like a straight bar really requires a lot more setup than people realize. From power cleaning and moving a bar at high velocity, that there's a certain amount of torque into the bar that needs to be established that a lot of people don't understand, number one, or two, know how to accomplish. So that trap bar just eliminates a lot of that. It puts them in a very neutral position, and it makes movement through those ranges of motion a lot more accessible. And then you'd mentioned the extensive plyos, which we completely agree as well. So I think the general message is bang for your buck is put in the time to build the base, build the foundation, because the changes and adaptations you'll get in those early stages of general physical preparation of moving weight will far outweigh the benefits you'll get from trying to jump into a more specific, tailored, plyometric based program where realistically your body's going to bleed the majority of that energy and try to find that release valve so that it doesn't injure itself. And you're talking about your knees, right? And for me, it's my spine and my lower back, where I think we were largely the opposite in many ways. You were very knee dominant naturally, spent a lot of time working through probably the more gross range of motion and deeper things like depth jumps and very, very, very power heavy movements, where I was a very reactive athlete naturally. So I spent a lot of time very hip and ankle dominant with a lot of the contacts I did. So the global stiffness that I attained, it was high, but also global stiffness also leaves less room for dissipating energy at the high end from things like landing. So it just it found my spine, and now they just are, I guess the discs are just shaped different. I guess that's just the reality of the situation now. So I think if we had blended our approaches, who knows?
Who knows? There's always, I think there's a price to pay for jumping's incredibly stressful, especially when you jump well.
Yes.
Because there's just more forces going through the body. So the extensive approach means you can get a lot more contacts and conditioning in without that payback, I should say, essentially. And I think that's why I quite like. I like depth landings as well, but not as extreme as probably what you've seen in some of my Instagram posts.
Right.
A little lower, and you can just, from my experience, you can get a higher amount of contacts without actually getting the stretch shortening cycle to turn around completely. So if you don't jump out of the depth landing with full intent, then you're going to save yourself a bit of stress down the line. Right. So I tend to often set my jump sessions up with a few depth landings, and I'll go through like a box jump into a depth landing, and so you're kind of taking care of both sides before we put them together. And what it ultimately means is I'll do slightly less volume of all-out jumps because I feel confident I've worked enough volume at each end of the spectrum before that. It's something that I didn't do as a younger athlete, and I wish I had done, because I probably wouldn't be wincing when I walk down the stairs now. But we all live and learn, and it's I'm sure that's your journey as well. You don't want your athletes now to have the injury struggles that you have in your 30s.
Absolutely,
which is the same as how I feel. Is I really don't want them making those same mistakes, because I think it's been a limiting factor as well. Pain is always a limiting factor, and it's been a limiting factor for me over the last few years, just from a performance standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you and I could podcast about a multiple topics and probably talk for hours and hours and hours. But I wanted to keep this more about you, your story, and then also talking about the general concepts that people can really pull from. I want to ask you one more question before we kind of wrap things up on this initial podcast. You're going to be back on before we know it. Absolutely had a blast chatting with you. Okay, for our audience, Ben, let's project that, well, in a lot of places gyms are closed. Okay. They're shut down. The pandemic has come through and created this global apocalypse that we're living through right now. But what one piece of equipment would you make sure you had at your home to optimize your training time within the home environment, sans gym? What are you making sure that you have? Could be any piece of equipment. What's going to be your go-to? You can think about that. I'm not going to make you jump on the spot, but think about it. Cause I've done this as well. I'm fortunate enough, obviously, to have a pretty full gym at my house, but in the circumstance of being an average athlete, I get a lot of questions like, well, what should I order? Should I order this or what can I,
Definitely.
And it's always nice to be able to give people a diverse answer. So let's hear it.
So, yeah, that's a very pertinent question right now, because I've been getting most of my athletes have had to switch up their training because of a lack of equipment since gym shut. And all of those athletes have a different amount of home equipment. So I've got athletes that have nothing, and that doesn't matter because you can do a hell of a lot with your body weight. And if you've got something you can grab hold of, just doing chin-up variations is incredibly good for strength gains. But I think, especially working with the guys and with a limited amount of equipment, I think the most useful piece of equipment I've seen during the shutdown has literally been a lifting resistance band. So just a lifting band in general. And I think that's because of the amount of different movements that you can do with it. And you could argue that maybe it doesn't have the same intensity as some other, like if somebody had, I could say, a barbell and 150 kilos of weights, and that's all well and good, but where the hell are you going to lift them? I tried to do a set of power cleans in my back garden, and the neighbours were running out thinking that someone's digging the road up. So, practically that's not going to work if you're at home. Yeah. And so from the guys that I've worked with, a resistance band has come in really, really handy. Along with that, actually, I've literally just used a towel for overcoming isometrics. So people just grab the towel, get their feet on it, pull up, and just get that isometric stimulus in before going through a larger range of movement. And the other thing I did was I just increased the range of movement with most exercises. So instead of the bench press, people were doing deficit push-ups. Instead of squats, people were doing pistol squats off a chair. So just challenging things either unilaterally or through more range of motion. But yeah, bang for my buck piece of equipment in lockdown would be a resistance band. The weight of that depends on your strength, but you can do good mornings, you can do squats, you can do jump squats, you can do resisted press ups. You're getting an accommodating resistance through that movement. You can get one hell of a burn on. At the same time, you can get your accessories done, because there's stuff that's going to be neglected in lockdown because you don't have your fancy cable machine to do your rotator cuff work and all this sort of stuff. But for me, any of my clients that had a lifting band, they've been good over lockdown and they've trained really hard. And now the gyms are opening in the UK, I think next week, they're hopefully going to go back in there without too much trouble getting back underneath the bar again.
Absolutely. Well, I'll second that motion. And we put out a program kind of at the beginning of quarantine that was body weight and resistance band, and we've been getting lots of great feedback about it. So it's resistance band. Absolutely. You can even bunch up a resistance band to the point where it almost doesn't stretch, and you can get almost an element of yielding of those isos behind a yielded fixed object. Sure. If you get enough tension built in, you're going to get similar stimulus to some of those isometrics that you spoke on. So absolutely, Amazon is full of them. Don't be like, I can't find them, or I can't. They are affordable. They are accessible. The entire world is being shipped to your front door right now. And invest a little bit in yourself. It pays back dividends. Ben, I appreciate you taking your time today to be here with us and really drop some great wisdom from the perspective of being an elite athlete and an absolutely stud coach. Where can people find you on social media? Where should we send them?
So my personal page is at Ben the Bounce. That's just one word. And then my business page is at Semtex_systems. So a lot of my content goes out on my personal page, and on the Semtex Systems page, a lot of my clients' content goes out. So that's more the platform of the people I'm working with. But yeah, mostly Instagram. I'm on Twitter at Ben the Bounce as well, and yeah, the Instagram is my main area. So yeah, anybody that wants to ask me any questions, come over there, drop me a DM. I like to reply. I like to meet new people. So that's how me and Tyler got talking in the first place. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And thanks for taking your time out and giving me this platform to speak on.
Anytime.
It's been a long time coming.
Absolutely. It's always open to you, Ben. So everybody knows out there, Ben is an individual that we support 100%. It's very important for us to surround ourselves with people that are like-minded in many ways, but also really just there to do one thing, and that is to help elevate the industry to a point where people are really getting what they need and kind of silencing the garbage and jargon that gets circulated around the internet. So Ben, we appreciate you obviously doing that from your end. That's all the time we have today for this episode of the Penultimate Podcast. Go check Ben out, and we'll catch all you guys in the next one.
The Penultimate Podcast is powered by Project Pure Athlete. Visit projectpureathlete.com and check out the complete line of PPA training and technique products. All products are created by the Jump Guy and have been used and endorsed by coaches and athletes worldwide. Jump higher, train smarter.
Bitch, sit down. Little bitch.